Hello everyone, and welcome to Marshall Society's Michaelmas debate entitled "Is House Believe that Austerity Economics has failed?" A particularly warm welcome to all the freshers, and I hope you settled in well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrew Lilico, and I am the president of the Marshall Society. The society, named after the renowned Cambridge economist Alfred Marshall, has been running since 1927, and our aim is to promote awareness of key economic issues to all students, and not just the economic students. It is thus fitting that we are hosting this debate today, given that we are living at a time when austerity is the central question of economics. Indeed, I'm trying to think back to a day when the phrase spending cuts was not used in the media in some way, and to be perfectly honest, I'm struggling. If we take a Keynesian viewpoint, spending cuts and fiscal austerity are arguably unsuitable, given that we are still in a recovery stage. But then on the other hand, we also need to consider the effect of a mounting debt level on future generations, as well as confidence towards the UK economy and the effect on financial markets. In my opinion, the question is really whether it is austerity economics that has failed, or rather the implementation of austerity measures in the UK, Western Europe, and in the US. But I'm very excited to be able to have 6 fantastic speakers here with us today. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Ravi, who will chair the debate.
Thank you, Josh. So, ladies and gentlemen, honoured guest speakers and fellow students, welcome to the Marshall Society's first ever Michaelmas debate. It's great to see so many of you here today, and we have 6 incredible speakers debating perhaps the most contentious topic within the domain of economics to this day. It goes without saying that this is going to be an exciting and lively debate, and I hope that you all enjoy it. So, let me introduce each of the speakers to you. First of all, on proposition, sitting closest to me, we have Sue Konzelmann. She is Director of the London Centre for Corporate Governance and Ethics and a Reader in Management at Birkbeck, University of London. She is also a Research Associate at the Centre for Business Research at Cambridge itself. To the left of her is James Bloodworth. He is a political commentator and editor of the blog Left Foot Forward. He has previously written for The Times, The Independent, The Guardian, The Observer, and The New Statesman. Jonathan Ports is a director for the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. Previously, he was the chief economist at the Cabinet Office, where he advised the Cabinet Secretary, Gus O'Donnell, and Number 10 Dowd Street on economic and financial issues. Opening opposition for us today, we have Steve Baker, MP. He is the MP for Wickham, a Conservative Party politician. He co-founded the Cobden Centre, which has been established to promote social progress through honest money, free trade and peace. He established and chairs the All-Party Commission, All-Parliamentary Group on Economics, Money and Banking, and sits on the Transport Select Committee. Andrew Lilico is a Director and Principal of Europe Economics. Andrew has directed major projects on financial services regulation, the cost of capital, pharmaceuticals, competition and impact assessment. He is a member of the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Sunday Times' Shadow Monetary Policy Committee. And last but not least is Professor Kevin Dowd, Professor of Finance and Economics at Durham and a partner in Cobden Partners. He has authored books on free banking, monetary economics and the current financial crisis. Kevin is a research fellow at the Independent Institute, a senior fellow at the Cobden Centre, and a member of the Academic Advisory Council at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Now that's our speakers introduced for you. Let me just outline very briefly how the format of this debate will work. Each speaker will have 12 minutes to tell you whether austerity has or has not failed. The first 2 minutes of their speech will be protected, as will the last 2 minutes. Now, by that we mean no other speaker or member of the audience can offer a point of information during protected time. You'll know when the speakers are out of their protected time, as Akash and my colleague Akansha will wave at signs. 2 minutes gone and 2 minutes left. In the middle 8 minutes, Feel free to offer points of information, both other speakers and members of the audience, but we leave it to the discretion of the speaker as to whether they accept or decline your points of information. If you do get accepted, please keep your point of information between 20 and 30 seconds at a maximum. After the second speakers on either side of the House, we will open the floor for 10 to 15 minutes for an audience point of information question session. During that time, we'll have in the region of 10 or so questions. So if you do have a question that you want to ask a particular speaker but don't get the opportunity to do so when they're speaking, then is your time. And that's pretty much it. At the end of the debate, we'll hold a vote to see whether you guys think austerity has or has not failed. So, without any further rambling from me, let me introduce our first speaker today, opening the case for proposition. That is Sue Konzelmann, the Director of the London Centre for Corporate Governance and Ethics. Thank you.
Austerity economics has failed. The evidence is unequivocal. Everywhere austerity has been implemented, unemployment and poverty rates have risen, incomes have stagnated, living standards have deteriorated, and inequality has increased. And all of this is being made worse by the government's single-minded adherence to a policy of balancing the budget and paying down public debt. Moreover, the accompanying fall in tax receipts and rise in unemployment-related social costs is causing fiscal deficits to increase, which in turn requires increased public borrowing to finance them. So even in its primary objective of fiscal consolidation, economic austerity has failed. Yet its advocates remain undeterred. They're also undeterred by the historical record. If you look back at history, there is not one single example of a case that supports the idea of expansionary austerity. And in fact, prior to 2010 and the turn to austerity, most economists believed that the idea that austerity is the appropriate policy in a recession had been firmly abolished by the experience of the Great Depression, or even more so, the Second World War. In fact, every time austerity has been implemented in a recession, the result has been economic catastrophe. Some of the most notable examples can be found during the interwar years. During the 1920s, the British Treasury view caused an immediate deep depression with massive involuntary unemployment and grinding poverty for large swathes of the population. And in the early 1930s, when Hoover resorted to austerity following the 1929 stock market crash, America's severe recession morphed into the Great Depression. In 1937, after the New Deal had delivered 4 years of economic growth, Roosevelt's turn to austerity caused the American recovery to fall back into depression. And this was only reversed by rearmament and the massive stimulus to the economy associated with World War II. Following World War II, there was a widespread commitment to not return to the appalling conditions experienced during the interwar years. And there was recognition that austerity is the appropriate policy for the boom, when the risk to the economy is inflation and financial crisis, but it's the wrong policy for the slump when the economic problem is involuntary unemployment as it is today. So why the current turn to economic austerity? In 2008, in response to the global financial crisis, governments around the world borrowed to bail out their systemically important banks. And they engaged in massive emergency monetary and fiscal stimulus to deal with the accompanying recession. This averted financial collapse, but as their economies slowly began to recover, concerns about the resulting high levels of public debt caused a reversal in policy, first in the Eurozone, especially in Greece and the peripheral Eurozone countries, but then more broadly, the United Kingdom being one of the leaders in this regard. Now, the justification was provided by seemingly high-quality academic research by Harvard economists Reinhardt and Rogoff. Their examination of the historical data, looking at changes in public debt to GDP ratios and GDP growth, revealed an inverse statistical correlation between public debt and growth. And they also were to find a debt threshold, 90% of GDP, at which the economy contracts. Now, when this research was published, politicians seized upon it and used it to justify the austerity programs that they wanted to implement. However, upon publication, the research was met with very serious and growing criticism until it was ultimately discredited. The first concern surrounded the direction of causation. Reinhardt and Rogoff suggest that high levels of public debt generate conditions which create economic stagnation. But it makes more sense to suppose that falling GDP growth is a contributor to rising public debt, because when GDP growth contracts, tax revenues fall and social costs rise, resulting in a deficit that needs to be financed. However, even more worrying is the quality of the data set that was used to generate these results. Researchers checking their results soon came to question the data set because no one was able to replicate them. And when the data was finally released to researchers at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, they discovered metadata, methodological problems, and Excel coding errors. When these were corrected, the debt threshold disappeared. However, despite the repudiation of their findings, Reinhardt and Rogoff have shrugged it off as academic kerfuffle. And advocates of austerity are unconcerned that the theoretical justification for these programs has been basically completely discredited. So the question is, why would a government stick to a policy of austerity when there's no theoretical justification and all of the evidence suggests that it's a total failure? And why would voters support austerity when it's clearly making households and businesses worse off? The government's defense is based on a series of alleged false beliefs. First, it claims that monetary policy can do the job, but with real interest rates negative and interest rates near their zero lower bound, monetary policy on its own is failing to rejuvenate the economy. They also claim that Britain has too much public debt, but prior to the 2008 financial crisis, British debt to GDP was at an historic low, close to its lowest level in 300 years. And even after bailing out the financial sector, Britain's public debt to GDP level is well below its long-term historic average of 110% of GDP. It also claims that Britain can't afford more debt. But even the IMF, the once high priest of austerity, is urging Britain to increase spending on public infrastructure that will generate real returns and will have a positive impact on employment and growth. The government also claims that by pursuing a policy of austerity, it will give it credibility, which in turn will contribute to lower long-term interest rates. The long-term interest rates are determined by the state of the economy, not the state of public finances. And the economy's stagnation since 2010 is doing very little to create confidence in the government's ability to manage the economy, much less its finances. Finally, it claims that public spending crowds out private spending. But after a recession, businesses are reluctant to invest until they see evidence of growing demand, and consumers are reluctant to spend until they feel confident about employment prospects. So there's no such crowding out, and the private sector can hardly be expected to lead the recovery. For voters, although the financial crisis causes and effects have been widely analyzed, they remain opaque, and the public has been sold the idea of austerity on the basis of appeals to ethics and morality concerning indebtedness, supported by misleading ideas and analogies about the nature of government finances. One of the oldest and most dividing of these is the idea that a government budget is akin to that of a household or a firm. But this is a fundamentally flawed analogy because first, a sovereign government who has control over its currency and a floating exchange rate, unlike a household or firm, is not operationally constrained by its budget because it can both create and adjust the value of its currency to manage a recession. Second, while the household or firm can reduce its deficit by cutting spending or paying down debts, a government cannot, because during a recession, tax revenues fall, social costs rise, the resulting deficit requires increased public borrowing to help finance it. So at times like this, when the economy is severely their own individual and collective situation worse. Today's policy of generalized economic austerity, like the 1920s Treasury view, has as its objective the reduction of public deficits and debts in order to maintain access to external finance. It forms no part of any coherent strategy aimed at fiscal or monetary stabilization or macroeconomic recovery. Rather, by addressing the consequences of our current economic difficulties instead of the root cause, austerity is addressing the symptoms rather than the disease that's afflicting the economy. And in this respect, it's the economic equivalent of the pre-scientific medieval practice of bloodletting, observing that the patient is getting sicker and bleeding some more. In economic terms, our current high levels of fiscal deficit and debt are the direct result of the 2008 global financial crisis and the need to bail out the banking sector. And this has only been made worse by the accompanying depression, which is being deepened by economic austerity. So at present, nearly a half century of pre-Keynesian economic policy has returned the world economy to more or less where it was during the early 1930s, with austerity having the same effect now as it did then. However, unlike that earlier period, when financial institutions were allowed to fail, financial speculators lost vast sums of personal fortune, and the financial services sector was returned to its role as the servant rather than the master of enterprise. Following the 2008 collapse of Lehman Brothers, the systematic rescue of financial institutions deemed too big to fail has convinced the markets that the costs and the risks of financial speculation will be socialized. However, the profits remain private. The bottom line is that austerity economics has failed to deliver on its promises, and it has shown itself again to be the wrong policy for the slum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stu. Let me just remind the audience and the speakers that you can offer a point of information during unprotected time during the speech as well. Okay, so now let me hand over to Steve Baker, MP for Wickham. He will be opening the case for opposition. Steve.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening. It's a huge honour to be here with you tonight in this august location with such a distinguished set of panellists on both sides of the question. We have before us the crucial question of our age: how to promote prosperity given the absolutely appalling crisis which lies behind us and perhaps, as I will argue, in front of us. There has been enormous human suffering and a real sense of injustice, and I'll begin by agreeing with Sue. It's absolutely wrong that there have been these bailouts. It's absolutely wrong to have profits privatised and commercial risks socialised. And if you were to go and look at the bills I introduced to the Parliament, you would see that I've made just that point in proposed legislation. There's a real problem right now with the welfare state. First, it does not produce the quantity or quality of welfare, health and education which the public need to deserve. And secondly, that we cannot afford it. But human suffering did not begin in 2010, and I would invite anybody to go back and look at the reports of the Centre for Social Justice in 2007 to see the scale of the problems we had, particularly there. Now, I have every confidence in the good intentions of those proposing this motion, but there is no kindness in it. No kindness in encouraging people to believe in the fairy dust economics of those who think we can keep on borrowing. To support this proposition, you must believe three things. You must believe that the policies which have been followed for the last few years have been austere. You must believe that they have failed by some criterion of success which has not yet been explained. And thirdly, that you must believe that there are some alternatives which would somehow prop up prosperity quickly out of the mess into which we've been placed. None of these things is true, and I'd like to deal with all of them. First, let's suppose that austerity has been tried. Has it failed? Well, I'll just draw your attention to the Chancellor's recent remarks in the House of Commons in Treasury questions. He was asked to give a statement, as usual, on his responsibilities, and he was asked to talk about wages, and he pointed out that the main deterioration in wages and salaries was from 2007 to 2009, when growth fell from 5.7% to -0.6%. He went on, last year, real household disposable income, which is really last year, grew by 1.4%, the fastest growth for 3 years. Of course, however, these remain difficult times for families, and the only way to deliver improved living standards for the long term is a sustained, balanced economic recovery with low mortgage rates and more income tax. Our economic plan is delivering that. I'll try and take interventions in a moment, but I want to make some progress. He was challenged by John Cryer, and the Chancellor replied that in the gentleman's own constituency, there are now 12,000 more people in work at the same time, at the time of the election, and unemployment was down by a third. Take the gentleman's point.
I mean, I feel like George Osborne's point is merely kind of a poor statistic. No one argues that wages didn't fall at the beginning of the recession and shouldn't be rising now. The fact is that they would have fallen by a lot less in the recession, and that's the kind of factor that we should deal with now.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point. What would have happened? Some of these counterfactuals are extremely interesting, but I'll come back perhaps to that if I may later. A point Sue made was about inequality. Later in the same Q&A, the Chancellor said inequality is now at its lowest level in this country since 1986. Later still in the debate, he pointed out that in Glasgow North West, the claimant count was down this year and employment was up. In other words, we're turning the corner and putting right what went so disastrously wrong. If you were to have a look at the House of Commons statistics recently, you would find that GDP growth is up by 0.7%, inflation's at 2.8%, a little over target but not diabolical, and services industry output is only just below its 2008 peak. Today, I saw on Reuters that the benefits claimant count has dropped by an amount unrivaled since, it's dropped by an amount that hasn't fallen by since 97, I think it was, that's observed. In any case, Reuters today, I encourage you to have a look. The payment count is down, employment is looking strong. If you believe we've had austerity, you ought to now start considering putting it to work by its own measures. We have not had the dreadful consequences of the 70s, the inflation, the unemployment, and the general levels of human suffering. But was this austerity? We have now, today, a bizarre paradox. That if you work in the Foreign Office, or if you work in the Attorney General's Department, or if you're in local government, or if you use local government services, then you have really quite significant austerity. But if you're sitting in Parliament, and you pick up the Red Book, let me tell you what it says in the charts which are available to you as a matter of public record. If you look at total managed expenditure, we came to government in the 11-12 outturn was 693.6 billion. This year the forecast was 720 billion. It then goes on 730.4 billion, 744 billion, 754 billion, 765.1 billion pounds in 2017-18. If you look at the tax figures, you'll see that what the Chancellor is doing is increasing cash spending and increasing taxes to match it. If this is austerity from the top down, I should be very surprised that you think profligacy is. So what then are the alternatives? Higher spending, more borrowing, higher taxes on the wealthy, more quantitative easing, perhaps? Let me just have a look at the context of where we are. Too few people understand that for the whole of my life, 40 years, we've been living in an era of big government. The Chancellor does not propose to give us small government. He merely means to get big government to live within its limits. We haven't had small government since the interwar years. We haven't had really small government since before the First World War, when ours was one of the greatest and most prosperous countries in the world, when friendly societies provided medical insurance to the vast majority of the working population, and doctors answered to the public. Compare that to today, my endless wrestling with the NHS. So that's state spending in the context of where we are. That's the borrowing requirement. You can't pay for it through tax, because it turns out people only pay about 40% of GDP in tax. You can see that the borrowing requirement has been high and unstable. We've only had 2 brief periods of surplus in the course of my life.
What happened to the debt-to-GDP ratio over that period?
It's a fascinating point. I'm looking forward to you explaining it in some detail, but I want to move beyond the debt-to-GDP ratio, because the debt-to-GDP ratio is always used. Suga talked about it and said, talked about the 300-year history of it. But the slide I'm going to come on to in a moment will show you where we're going. This is a chart from the Bank for International Settlements on the future of public debt prospects and implications. The UK is the bottom central chart. The details, for a moment, let us just leave the numbers apart. But let me tell you this. In their booklet, in their pamphlet, they explain that by 2040, on this trajectory, the UK would be spending a quarter of GDP on debt interest. Now, if you can only take 40% of GDP in tax, which is what we've seen historically in the 20th century, and you're spending a quarter of GDP on debt interest, you've only got 15% for welfare, for health, for pensions, for education, for justice, for defence, for policing. What this chart tells me, when we're talking about the trajectory of debt, where it's going, this tells me that in my lifetime, and in your lifetimes, whether we like it or not, we are going to have to fundamentally rethink the state. The third way that government funds itself, the one which is always forgotten by those who think we should spend more and tax more, is this. Rulers have always debased the currency. They tax, they borrow, they debase the currency. They used to flip the coinage, and now money is loaned into existence. This is the trajectory of M4. If you were to look at the numbers from the Bank of England, you would see that M4 tripled between 1997 and 2010, from £700 billion to 2.2 trillion. You cannot triple the money supply in the country through new debt without profound consequences. Those profound consequences include asset bubbles likely to break the financial system, widening wealth inequality, and a redistribution of economic activities towards the source of the new money. So it should not surprise you that those working in the banking system have done so very well, whereas those working in the private sector far from London have not done so well. Nor should it surprise you if you look at the regional distribution of house prices, that Scotland has seen lower rises than London. You shouldn't have been surprised that house prices in Islington and Chiswick started rising shortly after Q began. If you were to look at price inflation back to 1750, this is what you see. You will find that we have lived, in particular I have lived, born in 71, in an era of price inflation unprecedented in the industrial era. And if you wish to see it on a log chart, I'll gladly show it to you later. The truth is that back in the 19th century, money gently gained in value. But since the end of Bretton Woods, the value of money has collapsed. This third mechanism of funding the state, debasing the currency, is the one that's always forgotten. It's the one that's crippled the financial system. It's the one that's manufactured injustice when it's been coupled with socialised commercial risks. It's the one that's hitting us hard now. A very wise economist once said, a critic of Keynes, he once said, "Today is already the tomorrow which the bad economist yesterday urged us to ignore." Today is not tomorrow. Proponents of this motion are offering us nothing but a cruel fairy tale, one which would hurt those least able to bear it. The cry is always that someone else will pay, but you talk to my constituents and you find the person paying is always you. It's you paying for the 18 or 20%. It's you paying fuel duty and air passenger duty and beer taxes. It's always you. It's your children that will pick up the debt. It's the pound in your pocket that's being robbed and the government engages in guilt. What astonishing days when the United States Federal Reserve is producing $85 billion a month. What meaning can society have? If you vote for this motion, you are voting for false hopes and cruel promises. If, like me, you have a care about the future and a heart for the poor, you will reject this motion and you will vote for honest money and 7 balanced budgets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Now, the second speaker on proposition is James Bloodworth, and he is the editor of Left Foot Forward. James.
Hi everyone, and thank you for having me here for this debate. This is obviously a debate about economics, and the motion I'm speaking for is the motion that austerity has failed. I think it has. If you look at some of the areas that actually matter in terms of people's lives, that's living standards, despite economic growth in recent months returning, for ordinary people things are still getting worse. The lessons from the crash are also not being learned. For all intents and purposes, it looks like George Osborne is inflating another housing bubble for a start. Rather than focus on dry economic data, however, I wanted to look at some of the real-life consequences of austerity. The economy is, after all, a bit like the plumbing in a house. It's important, very important, but it's important that the plumbing works, but people don't buy a house on the basis of its plumbing. In other words, yes, economics matters. I imagine you'd all be quite offended if I said it didn't. But it should also answer a bigger question. Is economic policy making Britain a better country to live in, or not? If you look at recent growth figures, it looks as if the country is starting to move out of recession. If you look at the number of people who are unemployed, it also looks like things are moving in the right direction. In reality, though, a recovery was going to happen at some point, whichever party was in office. The key thing to keep in mind is what has happened in the intervening time. In other words, if we return to the sorts of growth we were experiencing before the crash, that doesn't necessarily mean that the austerity of recent years will not have a lasting impact as we move forward. When Labour came to office in '97, the economy was growing at an impressive rate. If you look at things in purely economic terms, you might say that despite the ups and downs of the 80s, Britain had been turned around by the time the Conservatives left office. And to some extent, I would agree. There were certainly some difficult decisions that needed to be made in the 1980s. No serious person today believes, for example, that companies like British Airways and Thomas Cook should still be run by the state. The globalisation of production also meant that some of Britain's heavily subsidised industries would inevitably have to be wound down at some point and all pass into private ownership. I also believe Labour would have carried out many of the big privatisations themselves had they come to office in the 1980s. It was the way that the decisions were pushed through by the Conservatives that had such a devastating effect. So, for example, the 80s and 90s saw a threefold increase in the number of people reliant on out-of-work benefits and a doubling of social security expenditure as a share of GDP. This was a direct consequence of rapid industrialisation, with little concern shown for the long-term consequences of such radical policies. The impact of the economic decisions taken in the 80s is still being felt today. Walk around a council estate in any former industrial town or city and you will soon know what I'm talking about. The impact also plays out in government statistics. The term Thatcherism is often thrown around by people like me on the left as a catch-all representing everything that is wrong with society. But the right has attached its own set of myths too. One of these is that Labour is the party of welfare, or more specifically, that the rise in the number of people on things like incapacity benefit in recent decades was somehow a problem created by Labour. This is misleading, and it's misleading because it completely ignores the fact that many of the people on incapacity benefit today are there as a direct result of the policies implemented in the 1980s. At the beginning of the 80s, for example, the idea that there were large numbers of people on benefits was unheard of. And it was unheard of because it was a problem created by the Thatcher government or as a result of short-term economic decisions made by that government. Go back to 1963, there were less than 500,000 people claiming incapacity benefit. By 2009, that figure was 2.6 million. particularly sharp increase took place after the recession of the early 90s, which added a further 800,000 incapacity benefit claimants to the rolls. Overwhelmingly, the claimants were and remain in areas which were rapidly deindustrialised by the Thatcher government. As well as other impacts of Thatcherite economics, around 25% of the world's population now live in the most deprived areas of Britain, as the country still struggles to recover from the decline in traditional industries. In Scotland, 5 former mining communities have the highest concentration of deprivation in Scotland. These are direct consequences of economic policy in the 1980s. The pit closures that followed the 1984 miners' strike, for example, were followed by a second devastating phase of closures. Just when it seemed like industry had recovered, this was another blow. It meant by the early 90s, mining employment in South Wales would be virtually wiped out. Sorry. Yes?
What was your alternative to the austerity policies introduced in the 80s?
Well, I would say that like I said, Labour would have had to implement some of those policies themselves, but it was the brutal nature that the industries were wiped out rather than buying down. My point going back to the 80s, though, should be clear. Decisions taken on purely economic grounds have a lasting impact on the population of areas affected by those changes, as well as on the policy decisions confronting politicians as we move forward into the future. David Cameron and George Osborne, for example, like to boast that the economy is growing and therefore austerity is working. However, it's taken much longer than they hoped for the economy to return to growth. And as a consequence of the Chancellor's failure to hit his growth targets, we will face at least another 5 years of austerity and cuts to services moving forwards. What impact then has austerity had on the British people, austerity this time around, and eventually when the economy does come back to a decent rate of growth, what impact will austerity and cuts have left? What legacy will austerity and cuts have left in Britain? I thought they will leave a massive legacy. One only needs to look at the impact austerity is having already. Rough sleeping in London has increased by 13% in the past year, with 6,500 people now sleeping rough in the capital. 50,000 council tenants are facing eviction because of the bedroom tax, with potentially tens of thousands more affected. The number of people working on zero-hour contracts has surged since the coalition came to power in 2010. Some estimate now that it's around 1 million people, 4% of the workforce, now on zero contracts. Britain has also suffered a substantial real-term fall in wages, the second biggest out of 20 countries since 2010. Inflation in Britain, this was reported today, is now the highest of any country in Europe. The number of people using food banks, again,
That's fine. Well, if you have even Keynesian policy, you would still expect golden wages, wouldn't you? I mean,
no, I don't think necessarily, no. I need to move on because I've run out of time. I would like to come back to it later though. The number of people using food banks to feed themselves and their families has gone from 40,000 a year under Labour to over 350,000 in the last 6 months alone. Is this austerity working? Also in Europe we're seeing a rise, austerity is having a massive impact in Europe politically. We're seeing a rise in the far right, with parties receiving up to a quarter of the votes in recent local elections. Today's unemployment figures continue the story of recent months. Rising employment, yet stagnating earnings. Employment among young people has failed to return to its pre-recession peak. The number of unemployed women has remained around the million mark for more than 2 years now. And a record number of people are working part-time because they cannot get full-time work.
More information, please?
Yeah.
Because what you described seems like a result of crisis, not of austerity.
Which in particular, because
All
there's...
the that you described is the general result of crisis in all the countries.
I don't think more people see the rough in London is that. I think policy has a big impact on that, and you can trace the policies that George Osborne brought in to specific things like the growth in food banks and specifically welfare policy. I'm going to have to carry on though.
Thank you.
Close to 80% of jobs created since June 2010 are in industries where the average wage is less than £7.95 an hour, according to TUC analysis. The culture of low pay is also stagnating local economies, ensuring that governments end up spending more money on things like housing benefit and working tax credits. This is a government that won't spend on social housing, yet they're spending around $20 billion a year on housing benefit, often subsidising private landlords. I'm aware the Labour Party was planning its own set of cuts, would it have won the 2010 election. That said, I don't think that if it had won, it would be the case. I think there would be a bit less zeal and enthusiasm for the cuts that we're now seeing from this coalition. I would also imagine that many of the horror stories we're seeing in the press are just the tip of the iceberg. What is certain is that austerity will have a long-term impact, and the longer it goes on, the worse that impact will be. Economic growth is only one part of the puzzle. It matters how growth is shared by wider society and how people are treated during the downturn, because it will have a massive impact on policy moving forward and on spending decisions in the future. We are dealing with human beings, after all, and not robots. The problems today might be different from the 1980s. Massive unemployment, for example, is not the biggest problem this time around, but that doesn't mean problems are not being stored up for a later date. Problems created by short-sighted and fanatical attachment to austerity economics. As we're all, I'm sure, aware, short-term thinking always has to be paid for by others over the long term. This is why I urge this House to support the motion that austerity economics is failed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Andrew Lilico, Dr. Andrew Lilico, Director, European Principles of Europe.
Thank you. So, we wanted to think about, once we evaluate whether austerity has failed, we certainly have some idea of where its point was. And in order to understand its point, I think we probably need to think a little bit about the context when it began. So I would date the first plans for austerity as coming in the autumn statement 2009 and in Alistair Darling's March 2010 budget. So and if we go back slightly earlier, the first statements about public spending cuts come in June 2009 in a famous exchange between David Cameron and Gordon Brown at Prime Minister's question time, following, coincidentally or not, a piece I'd written a week or so earlier advocating very large spending cuts. The context at that point was that we had the largest contraction in GDP in the UK since the 1920s. We had ended up, rightly or wrongly, but we'd ended up bailing out the banks with the consequence that the implicit liabilities of the government, not simply its narrow sovereign debt, but the total liabilities, the things it was responsible for, were some 300 to 450% of GDP. So this was in fact much larger liabilities than we'd ever seen in the past when we took them in total. And there was a very genuine concern at that point that the UK might resort to international scrutiny of its budgets. In fact, there were those who proposed that we should volunteer for IMF scrutiny of what was going on because they didn't believe that our own internal political processes could deliver anything like the scale of cuts to public spending and rises in taxes that would be required to deal with what was at the time expected to be around £180 billion deficit, or some 12% of GDP. In fact, we now know that if you include some of the bailout numbers in the figures that you probably should, then we peaked at more than 200%, getting on to 220 billion pounds is our deficit, including the bailouts of banks, so something like 14% of GDP. These are very, very large deficit numbers that we had at the time. So in that context, what I think was the most proximate risk was that we would find that the underlying growth rate of the economy would not be sufficient for the banks to recover enough that they would not go bust, thereby dragging down the government and making the government go bust. So the real concern for the UK wasn't that we would default on our sovereign debt or ordinary things in government issues. It was that we would default on the debts which the government had assumed responsibility for by bailing out banks. So the first big risk was that we would find that we went the way as subsequently went Ireland and Spain, and Cyprus, that the bankruptcy of our banks rendered our government bankrupt. The second significant risk was that although, as things stood, the yields at the time, the government, the bond yields and so on, weren't terribly bad, if anything went wrong, then we might be forced into precipitate additional, very large tax rises and spending cuts that weren't those about shooting, but instead were forced upon us by bond markets or by international agency scrutiny. A third point was that we wanted to have our politicians stay in control of the process. So what we wanted in the UK was that it would be the House of Parliament rather than the IMF or somebody doing things. So there was some debate about how best you could achieve this. So there was, before 2008, the consensus amongst economists was that the role of fiscal policy such as it was, perhaps there was some short-term gains you could have by deficit stabilisation of various sorts, that was really to be delivered by what we call the automatic stabilisers. So when you enter a recession, your tax take falls and you have a little bit of extra welfare spending, and these automatic stabilisers tend to mean you run a little bit of higher deficit in a recession, perhaps you run a bit of surplus in a boom, and that's really the way that that's all that you need to do. You don't need to have any positive, deliberate action beyond those stabilisers. Macroeconomic action which was deliberate was to be delivered via monetary policy, by cutting interest rates or by printing extra money. That was really the pre-28 consensus. Now when it came to 29, there were those, 28, 29, there were those who said, well, maybe that's all right in ordinary times, but when you have your banks go bust, there are good reasons to think you might do some extra things, like have deliberate tax cuts. And of course, I was one of those who advocated that idea. In late 2008, we did have a deliberate temporary tax cut, which had to VAT, which had some success, I think, as a policy. But although I think it was reasonable to think that there was something that could be done by that, in truth, the scale of the deficit that we ran was far beyond anything, I think, that plausibly delivers short-term, any stimulus, even in the short term. What we're talking about, in the past, when Keynes was talking about having temporary deficits and so on, the kind of thing that people had in mind was something like 2-3% of GDP. That kind of figure is why, in the Maastricht convergence criteria, there was a constraint of 3% of GDP deficit. Because what people thought was that 3% of GDP should be enough latitude that you could really deliver all that was useful in terms of temporary stimulus by running deficits. What we're talking about for the UK, 12% of GDP, these kind of figures, I don't believe that there is any reason to believe that you have more stimulus to growth in the short term by running a 12% of GDP deficit than a 10% of GDP deficit. And I think that there isn't, so one can have articles of faith about this. Those who assert otherwise, I think, don't really have any evidence. Everybody, for example, would agree that you don't get any extra stimulus by running a 99% of GDP deficit versus a 95% of GDP deficit. Everyone would agree that at some point, running larger and larger deficits must stop out. It starts to run out, in effect. So I think that there's every reason to think that that has happened by the time you get to 10, 12% of GDP. One reason I think that is because, contrary to what was said before, there was actually very extensive evidence that very often when you have spending cuts, programs in particular, and indeed fiscal consolidations in general, you actually get faster growth. So it was suggested that there's no evidence that that's never happened. In fact, the definitive study on this was done by the European Commission in 2003, and it found that out of 47 significant consolidations, in 23 of the cases, so around half of the time, you had faster growth during the period of consolidation than you would as a consequence of in the period of consolidation. Yes?
Weren't these during periods of economic growth, growth in demand, falling exchange rates? I believe that those studies have been found to be not associated with recession.
No, there were in fact reductions. What we're talking about is periods of recession, which were then associated with deficits, and then when they cut their deficits, then there's faster growth in the periods after than they had before. This is the European Commission's 2003 study. In addition to this, out of those 23 cases, 11 of them didn't involve any monetary easing. So they were what are called pure non-Keynesian effects. So this was, and the other thing to say about this is that what we're talking here are cuts in contexts where the deficit was much smaller, no higher than around 6% of GDP. And there's every reason to think that when the deficit is much higher, then you get much less bang for your buck of extra deficit. So correspondingly, by cutting your deficit, you get more impact. Okay, one more thing.
There's a 2010 study by the IMF that discredits the study you're referring to.
Now, I think the 2010 study you're referring to by the IMF actually refers to the Alcina work, and what they claim in the 2010 study there is that they form a judgment as to, it's a very judgmentally based study. I could go into detail, but I don't think I need to do that. The other thing that I would say about this is that lacking a time travel technology, neither I nor others in the UK debate in 2009, when we committed to spending cuts, were materially influenced by a 2010 Ryan Hart and Rogoff paper. So that 2010 Ryan Hart and Rogoff paper didn't feature, it wasn't a significant factor in the UK's debate on austerity. Furthermore, the Ryan Hart and Rogoff paper, which referred to earlier, simply duplicated results which have been repeated many times subsequently and many times since in other papers. So furthermore, Ryan Hart and Rogoff would hotly dispute that they've been in any way refuted. So people found some minor coding errors in a particular Excel file which made no difference to the median number, which was the key number that they focused other than that, all the other complaints against them are contentious points of academic buckle, as was earlier. So they're not a matter of being refuted, they're a matter of making a different academic judgment about how you model things. They will defend that their way of doing it is right. Now, the other thing, I think that it is very much to be disputed whether what has happened in the UK is probably characterised as austerity. Because what we really did, we had some very significant tax rises in 2010, 2011. We raised VAT twice by 2.5%. There were also some capital spending cuts where what happened was that the incoming Conservative and Liberal coalition in 2010 implemented the Labour Party's capital spending plans, which they put in 2009. Now, those were actually quite inadequate in terms of the amount of deficit reductions associated with them. So the Conservatives then scheduled a whole load of additional cuts to current spending, day-to-day kinds of spending, things which are more useful to cut over the longer term rather than just cutting away your investment programme. But those things didn't really bite until much later years. There are those who say, so Jonathan Portis, for example, might say, and I would have some sympathy with him, that they should have not done so much of those capital spending cuts at that point. But I don't think that, I think it's politically naive to believe that you can come in and announce a whole load of additional spending cuts whilst cancelling a load of the ones that were already in place. It was difficult enough to get political agreements on the extra ones without cancelling the ones that didn't. So in terms of those three, so if we think about what those three key things were that the risks that we faced, so that is the risks of the banks going bust and of you being forced into something restricted and of you losing your political control. I think that by thinking about those three, we can evaluate how successful in retrospect the austerity programme has been. Let's think about the first one. So in terms of the banks going bust, obviously, whilst in many other countries in the intervening period, we've had very significant further deterioration in the banking sector. In the UK, we haven't. So, like it or not, you can complain, I complain about all kinds of things to do with the way we manage banks. Our banks haven't gone bust. From the side. That was a genuine concern that they would go bust and drag down the state. It actually happened in other countries. It didn't happen here. I think fewer people now expect it to happen. I actually think the jury's still out on this, because I don't think we'll really know until interest rates get back to 5.5%, 6% or so, but the banks can survive that. But that hasn't happened yet. The second point, in other countries, when events deteriorated, the Eurozone crisis and other international problems in 2010-11, they were then forced into doing faster austerity than they had originally planned. In the UK, we did exactly the opposite. Because we acted early, we were able, by acting early, to have enough credibility. But when things went wrong here, we actually relaxed the programme. So from through 2011 and subsequently, the deficit was scheduled to be 120 billion each year. Then George Osborne took the decision not to extend this austerity programme in late 2011 in response to the slowdown in the economy. And he was able to do that, whereas in other countries, they weren't able to do that, precisely because he had acted early, whereas in other countries they acted late. And the third thing, and I think that this is in some ways the most significant of all of the gains in the austerity programme, is that when you chaps go outside and you stick up your placards and you complain about cuts, 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 on your placards you have Cameron and Osborne as your bad guys. You do not have Angela Merkel and Christine Lagarde. And that's precisely because our politicians decided that they wanted to stay in control of events and not have them imposed from abroad. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, before we move on to the third speakers on either side of the House, we will have a question and answer session. Let me explain how this will work. We'll take 3 batches of 3 separate questions. After each batch, the speakers will have a chance to respond to those questions. So I'll just get the ball rolling, first of all, with a question of my own. So I just wanted to introduce a global perspective to the debate we're having today, because the motion doesn't necessarily confine us to speaking about the UK alone. And when we do take this global perspective, there seems to be a variety of different results from austerity. So on the one hand, you can look at the austerity experiences of the pigs or the gypsy countries, who a lot of people would argue their austerity experiences have been mitigated disasters. On the other hand, you can look at Germany 2002, 2003, and Latvia and many cite their austerity experiences as the harbinger of economic success in the future. So my question is, what can we learn from the austerity experiences around the world? Now, if you do have a question, please do raise your hand and we'll bring round a microphone.
Is it possible to have the lights?
Yeah, that's what we did. Yeah. Any questions? I'm sure one of those.
Hi. Dr. Lilico. So I guess there's this argument that a kind of margin of 2% on deficit reduction would make things either way, and therefore that it wouldn't be a serious issue moving from 12% to 10% deficit. And I guess also this is quite a kind of verifiable and credible claim that's deeply testable by econometrics. And most recently we've had from the OBR, from Oscar Holder and Alan Taylor, from the IMF, and from most of econometric theory on the subject, when interest rates are under zero bound, that multipliers are around 1.5, and that the cost of growth are really large, whatever the size of the deficit, contracting by about 2%. And I think it bears saying that this is quite well established as a matter of economic science, and that marginal reductions in deficit are quite large.
Thank you. One more question in this batch of three. Yes, sir, friend.
Yeah, so my question is for James. So firstly, you mentioned the 1980s and the industrial policy. So my question is, how do you know that was a result of the policies of the Thatcherite governments at those times, and not of the poor industrial policies of the governments of the social democratic consensus, and their attempts to center around trying to bunch all the industries together, like the British mainland, etc. Yeah. And my second question is about warning times. So the examples you brought up about the social consequences of austerity, in a way they did establish a correlation between what's happening now and the social consequences, like people love speaking, but I mean, I cannot see any real causation links between your argument and the result. So how could you know that it was the Labour government at the moment, not the Conservative government, that you wouldn't have these results? Could you also have any evidence in favour of some causation links, not just correlation links? Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to pick it? James? Yep.
Hey, thanks for your questions. Firstly, with regards to nationalised industry in the 80s, I'm not here to defend those industries. I think in many instances they were poorly run, wasteful. The state can be worse than private industry running big organisations. It was the way they were kind of wound down. The rug was essentially pulled out from under them, and economically that may have made sense. The government was losing lots of money subsidising those industries. It left whole swathes of the country where there were no jobs anymore, and people were then on the dole and incapacity benefit for many years, and it's proved very, very hard to get those people back into work. When people spend a lot of time on or out of work, it becomes harder and harder all the time to get them back into work, and I think that's what's happened there. As to your point, causation, with regards to rough sleepers, a lot of the local councils have, the Westminster Council, for example, has cut funding for shelters for rough sleepers, for example, as a direct result of trying to save money to please national government, and that seems like a fairly obvious reason why there would be more rough sleepers in London, for example. And you've seen other councils throughout the country implementing cuts which have essentially been imposed on them by David Cameron and George Osborne. So I think there is a link with that. Some cuts Labour would have brought in as well themselves. And I don't necessarily say I support that either. Some of them I do, some of them I don't. I'm not here to defend the Labour Party, but I do think there is a link between some of the cuts we're seeing and some of the stats I've quoted. Thanks. Few questions.
I was going to take globalization.
Okay, well, I'll do one very quickly and I'll do two very quickly. So I would say in terms of the international experience, I would say the key part of international experience is that losing control of your deficits and ending up having to do things precipitously faster than you might have chosen to do otherwise isn't any fun. Well, that's what I would say was the central feature of international experience of recent years, and you can end up with 25% unemployment and so on. And a lot of people who start saying, well, you shouldn't be cutting your deficit, but what choice do you have when nobody will lend you any money? The second thing that I would say is, in terms of the suggestion about econometric relationships, the problem with that is that you don't know what the counterfactual is. So what you lack is a knowledge of what would have happened had you not cut your deficit. And when we have almost no cases in history where, actually we have 0 cases in peacetime history where somebody ran a 10% of GDP deficit and subsequently evidence suggested that they would have been better to run a 12% of GDP deficit. We have lots of cases, mainly in developing countries, but not really in developed countries, in which people ran a 10% of GDP deficit and subsequent analysis suggested they had done better to run much lower deficits. Because one of the problems with running a very high deficit and then raising it even further is that eventually people run out of confidence and won't lend you any money. Furthermore, if you keep going, then you find that you don't address your fundamental structural issues. So you don't cut back on your spending, you don't address your labour market rigidities, you don't deal with your public sector pay, and things get worse before they get better.
I was just going to address what might be learned from other countries' experiences, and I think Britain doesn't really have much to learn from the Eurozone countries, because those countries, unlike Britain, don't have control over their currencies, and they don't have floating exchange rates. So they had really no alternative as long as they stayed within the Eurozone to going along with the austerity that was imposed upon them in exchange for bailouts. I think Britain can learn something, though, from the American experience, which sadly, speaking of my fellow Americans, is not going well with the debt crisis debate, the Republicans holding things up. Prior to the issues that we're coping with now, if you look at the American case, America didn't impose austerity. And America did much better than Britain did in the early stages of the crisis as a result of not having imposed it. In March, they were forced to, or Obama was forced to sign the sequester because the politicians couldn't come to an agreement about alternatives. So they did sign austerity in March. So now they're going to experience similar things to us. But I think early on, they did much better than Britain, which shows that austerity really is counterproductive if you're in a very serious recession. It only makes it worse to the point where it's a depression.
Let's hold on to the next round of questions.
Just on this point of global work experience, Angela Merkel said this: if Europe today accounts for just over 7% of the world's population, produces around 25% of global GDP, and has to finance 50% of global social spending, and it's obvious that we'll have to work very hard to maintain its prosperity and way of life. People are catching up with the reality that we can't afford what government does. In the United States, there's a wonderful video on this on Learn Liberty. If you add up all their mandatory spending, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all the food stamps programs, all of that stuff, very necessary, that all people absolutely rely on, it comes to more than their tax revenues, before you've even started to think about their enormous defence budget and all the rest of the things which constitute the state. The left in the US want to cut the defence budget. Well, there might be an argument for it, but if you abolish the US defence budget completely, you still have to cut the United States welfare state. And yet people think there isn't one because it's such a failure. It looks like there isn't one because there's such an abject poverty. All around the world, governments find themselves skating on thin ice, propping up unaffordable pledges that they've made for 100 years by printing money. And it will end, aren't you? Happy thoughts. It will end. It will end in our lifetimes. Perhaps you heard it here first.
Thank you. So the next batch of 3 questions. Jessica. Traditionally in recessions, we've seen productivity rise as all the companies that are very productive basically go fast. This recession is really different because we've seen a rapid and very, very substantial change in Bank of America's behaviour. We've seen very long, sustained low interest rates. And as a result, we've got all the zombie companies and there are very unproductive companies in our world. This means that now short-term growth is actually really important. And given that austerity has effects on short-term growth, we can argue about medium-term and long-term growth, but cutting government spending is going to have a short-term impact on growth. Do you think now is not the time to be risking the growth when our productivity is so low and we're using years worth of investment and expenditure? Thank you. Just on the left over there.
The question is about global economies. You say that we cannot look at continental Europe, for example. I would urge you to direct attention towards all the countries, Estonia, Lithuania, which are also child of austerity and which are currently has one of the highest, probably the highest levels of growth in the European Union.
Thank you. One more. Just to the right over there.
I think you can hear me about mine. But my question was a bit about the definition, because here everyone, I think, has in his mind a different definition of austerity, because you've spoken as if Britain undertook harsh austerity. Then what about Italy? What about Greece? I mean, I think the point is that some of the speakers on my right, well, they say austerity is like, it's very, some mild cut on budget deficit and that's austerity. Well, austerity can also be running budget surpluses like Ireland has been doing, and there has been some mixed effects. So I think it actually comes down to the degree of this intervention. So I would like to clarify what, for example, the MP thinks about what austerity is, because I don't really think Britain undertook harsh austerity, but you could ask the Greeks or the Italians or the Spanish people, where their unemployment is at 25%. Not in Greece, but Britain all the time.
Okay, thank you.
Just on the point of zombies, look, nobody wants pain, least of all investors and least of all perhaps the department employees. But the fact is this, every obstacle has been erected to try and put off, every obstacle has been erected to try and avoid a correction. And so we shouldn't be surprised the result is we've got a zombie economy and a stagnation. This is what happens if you try to avoid letting society work through that process known as market exchange. I'm not surprised. The question is, are we back into a corner and what should we do to get in? On the point gentleman made about language, I'd really recommend you, whether you'll be dismayed by it, I don't know, but Lawrence Kotlikoff wrote a very interesting paper called On the General Relativity of Fiscal Language, where he talks about just the problem you've mentioned and ended up sort of in the abstract concludes that most of these conversations end up being exercised in linguistics, not economics. That might very much go to your point, but what I would say about this is living within your means is not austerity. It's not austere to live within your means. Now, earlier Sue talked about the various naive, actually, things that people on the austerity argument tend to say. This is one of the problems. Government is not like a household budget. Yes, it can manipulate money supply, and yes, that is one of the causes of the crisis that we're in.
Brief observations on the international comparison point. It's clearly absurd to compare what's happening here to what's happening in Greece or Spain. That doesn't mean what's happening here is right. We haven't made, as I frequently said, I'll say more about this later, and I agree with Andrew on something point, we did not keep on digging the way that the Greeks and Spanish have been forced by the European Commission and Angela Merkel to dig. So the situation is not parallel. It doesn't mean that serious mistakes weren't made here and serious consequences materialized. On the Baltics, Estonia has done quite well for various reasons. Latvia, however, which is frequently pushed by the Commission as opposed to job for Eurozone austerity, by my reckonings, well over 10% of Latvia's young people have left the country as a direct consequence of what happened to the Latvian labour market. Those people are predominantly the younger and more skilled members of Latvian society. Latvia is now facing demographic implosion as a consequence. To proclaim that as a success is just bizarre, I'm afraid.
Okay, we'll hand over to Andrew and then have one more round of questions after that.
So, on the question of the low productivity growth, I would say that one of the key things about low productivity economic growth is that that is a reflection of the policy. So we are by having extremely low interest rates for an extended period of time, we are keeping businesses in play that might otherwise have been liquidated and releasing capital, which would have been faster growth over the medium term. So I wouldn't think that the solution to that is to have even more accommodative policy. The right response to that is to think that there are consequences over the medium term of your policy, so you should, when you have the opportunity, try to be easing out of your hype behind it as soon as it starts. As to the questions of where one learns from, so I would agree with Jonathan that the Baltics are not particularly comparable. I think that the scale of the cuts that were implemented there is a reflection of, so they had something like 8.8% GDP growth per year in the decade to 2007 in Latvia. So by having something like 20 to 23% internal devaluation, they only took themselves back a couple of years in terms of time. Having an equivalent level of internal devaluation in Greece is going to take you back. Because they only had about 4% growth in the period. What you're talking there is more than a decade. In Portugal, what you're talking is going back an entire generation. So I don't think that they're that comparable. The places that I would think it was most relevant to learn from would be the countries in Europe that were most similar to the UK before the crisis, namely Spain and Ireland. So these were countries which, before the crisis, had fairly similar debt to GDP ratios to the UK, fairly similar budget deficits to the UK, and fairly similar banking sector to GDP positions to the UK, and fairly similar house price groups to the UK. And we can see from the experience of Spain and Ireland, which were both AAA back in 2008, Spain was, in fact, had lower yields than the UK in 2010, that it was a very realistic possibility that the UK could go the same way. Now, saying that they're in the euro, so they screwed up, back in 2010, we thought being in the euro was a key reason why yields in Spain were so low. They thought that being in the euro was a support. And it just isn't true that printing your own currency means you can't have a sovereign debt crisis, which means that the sovereign debt crisis can take a slightly different form. It didn't prevent the UK from having a sovereign debt crisis in the 1970s, for example. It doesn't prevent many countries around the world having print their own currencies from having sovereign debt crises today. It's just a mistake to say that. The last thing that I would say on this is that in terms of the US, so there are lots of, the US was mentioned just before, very briefly on that. According to, it's highly debated whether the US has a materially different deficit reduction program from the UK. On the OECD structural deficit figures, it's actually almost identical to that of the UK from 2010 to 2013. And in addition, the US situation is very different. The US had only around half the level of contraction in GDP to start with, probably indicating that prior to the crisis, it didn't have nearly so much of a bubble as the UK in terms of growth, GDP growth. So the US situation just wasn't nearly as bad as that in the UK or Spain or Ireland. So not nearly so much adjustment was required. So saying subsequently they didn't do so bad is really no surprise.
Okay, we'll have one last round of questions. Just over here.
Hi. What I'd like to ask the so the opposition, is what's the exact transmission mechanism that you're trying to put forward for austerity economics? So far I've seen kind of two possible transmission mechanisms. Let's put aside what the Conservative MP like spilled on multiple facts and figures and didn't really say anything of any worth. But so certainly Andrew, you said that possibly the first one was to do with like what the yields would be, but then coming and having a look at that, Britain has actually had some of its lowest yields it's ever had, and in 2010 I think its yields were actually lower than that of Germany. And I think the second point you tried to put forward was about like some confidence fairy. It was going to like fly around the economy and somehow make everyone start spending more. So yeah, I'd quite like to hear your thoughts on how austerity economics is actually going to help stimulate growth in the economy.
Thank you. Any more questions? Just at the front over here.
Thank you. My question is a simple one and a fairly general one. Mr. Osborne is busy underwriting mortgages with government funding. In Germany, they underwrite business loans and fund new growth with that. Nobody so far has really covered the idea that perhaps we should be looking at encouraging new ways to pay for these things as opposed to cutting back on the deficit instead? Thank you.
Thank you. One final question. Okay, over there.
There's a point of viewing the gentleman here referring, asking the question how the austerity can actually improve our economy. I really haven't heard ideas whether austerity is good in principle. Maybe not now, maybe later. You know what I mean? So maybe you can provide some plans whether we should have done austerity at all. Because the argument by the opposition is that it has to be done. And it has to be done sooner rather than later for certain reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. Who'd like to start? Sue?
I'm going to start. I'd really like to say I've been
So you've asked about the transmission mechanism, and since you've also insulted me, I'm going to let Andrew answer the question. What I'd say to you is this. I did not force my way in here. Some people over the Marshall Economic Society have heard me speak before, and they thought I had something worth listening to say. So I'm sorry that I fumbled one or two of the interventions. I am. Perhaps one day you'd like to show me how to do it, but in the meantime I'd just say to you that if you fancy your life in public policy, if you want to be a public figure, if you wish to stand in front of audiences, you better learn fairly quickly that contempt is not an attractive kind of characteristic.
And I've got sort of an easy response to the question of the time or when is austerity appropriate. And austerity, it's not that austerity as a policy is a bad policy. It's very appropriate in the right time. And the right time is when the economy is overheating. So when the economy is at risk of inflation and financial crisis, then austerity is absolutely the right policy to keep the economy from experiencing those very damaging outcomes. But it's the wrong policy if the economy is in a recession. That's the problem, because when the economy is in a recession, austerity simply makes the downturn deeper and longer than it would otherwise be. So I would say it's not, I mean, we do eventually have to balance the budget. We do eventually have to pay down the debt. But it's impossible to do that if the economy is in a downturn. So the timing is when the economy begins to recover, then gradually find a way of dealing with those problems through austerity.
So I was asked about the mechanisms by which you want to expect austerity to have an impact on growth. So there are three key mechanisms, what I call the three main non-Keynesian effects that people identify. So the first of these is that if you cut public spending, then that tends to be associated with more rapid underlying growth over the medium term. If you end up with faster medium-term growth, then your households today, anticipating that they will be richer in the future, are able to spend and borrow more today, so that you get a short-term boost to consumption and investment as a consequence of raising the medium-term growth rate of the economy. It's actually a very well-established long-term relationship that between around 25% of public spending to GDP and around 55% of public spending to GDP, for each additional 1% that you raise the level, the share of spending in GDP, you lose between 0.1 and 0.15% of your annual growth rate. So if you raise your public spending level by, say, 5% of GDP, you should expect to lose about 0.5% of growth each year. So if you were growing at 2% each year pre-crisis, then you'd expect to be growing at only 1.5% thereafter if you raise your spending so much. So that's one kind of impact. That affects your pre-tax level of income of households. The second mechanism is that if you cut your spending early, then people take that as a signal that you are less likely to resolve your deficit problems over the medium term by raising taxes. So that means that they think that their post-tax medium-term income is likely to be higher. As a consequence of their post-tax income being higher over the medium term, they are then freer to spend and to invest today. The third kind, so each of those first two mechanisms, bear in mind, is particularly focused on the impact of public spending cuts as opposed to taxation. it's much better to cut spending really than to raise taxes. And in fact, one of the key criticisms of the deficit reduction program in the UK was that it's heavily dependent on tax rises in this early period, more than half compared with international best practice, which is that around 80% of your program should be focused on spending cuts rather than tax rises. The third kind of mechanism, though, is relatively indifferent as to whether you do things by spending cuts or tax rises, which is that if you don't have your deficit and control your debt, there is a concern that financial markets will lose confidence in what you're doing, and you will experience a yield spike. So you will find that your interest rates go up, households suddenly face much higher mortgage interest payments and other kinds of debts, and so as a consequence they are less able to service their payments even in the short term, and so as a consequence of it, by cutting spending you reduce the risk of a yield spike because you then have lower risk of a yield spike and the precipitate contraction in GDP associated with that. Taking away that risk, again you free people to spend more in the short term. So those are the three key kinds of non-Keynesian effects that people identify.
Thank you. We'll move on to the final speakers on each side of the House now. Thank you for some fascinating questions, and thank you to the speakers for some fascinating responses. So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Ports, head of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, to conclude the case for proposition. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. I will try and pick up some of the points that have been made as well as go through my slides. My apologies. And so first, let me take head on the points that Andrew just made about how austerity might have boosted growth in the short term. The first two effects were both bad expectations. The idea that cutting spending would lead to higher expectations about medium-term growth. The second, that cutting spending would lead to expectations about lower taxes. I think, frankly, it stretches credulity to think that anybody, after the announcement of the in June 2010 and August 2010 of the government's plan for fiscal consolidation, thought that as a consequence they personally were going to be better off. That they would have more money in their pockets as a consequence of the tax rises and public spending cuts that were announced at that point. And that's what you have to believe those two mechanisms. I would also note, and I agree with them, that you do need to anchor long-term expectations that the government's not going to blow up. But you do that by enacting a credible fiscal consolidation plan over whatever time period. And as Sue said, there is a generally accepted theory about the timing of fiscal consolidation, and that not that you don't need a credible fiscal consolidation plan, but that the type of consolidation plan at the time of very severe recession ought to be backloaded. So there is no gain from having more pain up front. Any gain you get in credibility comes from the credibility of the plan, not from the timing. And then the final point Andrew made was about the, and this of course was the rationale that was announced at the time, was about the downside of not having early spending cuts, which was that the financial markets. Well, so let me come on to that. And so let me say, this was the rationale that was announced at the time. Vince Cable said we were going to be like Greece. The Treasury said that our AAA credit rating was under threat. You know, and that of course would be disastrous. Because if our AAA credit rating was taken away, then bond yield would spike, we wouldn't be able to borrow any money. So we had no choice about austerity. It wasn't that austerity would be a great outcome, we simply had no choice, because if not, gilt yields would spike, we wouldn't be able to borrow money, we'd have a crisis. So we had to have a deficit over 4 years, not just have a deficit over 4 years, what the previous government promised, we had to eliminate it. We had to do that. If we didn't do those things, disaster would strike. Well, what happened? As what we all know, of course, we didn't do those things. As Andrew pointed out, deficit reduction is stalled. We haven't eliminated the deficit over 4 years. We're not going to even have it over 4 years at this rate. As for our AAA credit rating, we all know what happened to that. Again, what happened to gilt yields? Well, here are two graphs, a graph of two lines. You can't really tell the difference between the two lines, so that's the point. One of those lines is the US government 10-year bond, the other is the British government 10-year bond. And what they show is actually low interest rates and very little to do with austerity here. Well, the reason we had the substantial fall in interest rates that we saw over the 2009-2012 period was the general poor performance of the world economy, and in particular here, as proxied here by the US government rate, very low real interest rates, reflecting the state of the world economy. That's what, yeah.
Is it not true that Ireland had a AAA rating in 2009 and Spain in 2010? How is it so obvious, was it so obvious to us in 2010, that losing out of the rating, a rating, would give us an experience like that of the US and France, rather than that of Spain or Ireland?
Because, as Sue said, that Spain and Ireland did have their own currencies and they couldn't print it. You don't, as the market said, you can't fight the debt. If all we had to do was to say that, people who shorted goods would get stung if necessary. And we've seen what happens. We have the empirical proof. I quite agree, Spain is a good comparator. Spain yields spikes, despite the fact that our debt and deficit have at least as bad a trajectory as Spain. We have seen that interest rates stayed very low here. Why is that? Because we have our own currency. And how did we know at the time? Yes, we did. I certainly said at the time. I said, why would anyone pay any attention to what the rating agencies say about UK or US government sovereign bonds? It's totally irrelevant. And I would also note that the classic paper by Paul de Grauer in the summer of 2010, at the time this thing was discussed, very explicitly compared the situations of Spain and the UK and gave a very clear theoretical explanation of why you couldn't have a run on UK government debt in the same way you could have a run on Spanish non-sovereign government debt. And Paul, of course, has been entirely vindicated by events. So, what should we have done? Well, this is easy. I was there. I was Norman Lamont's speechwriter. I don't know how many people that really know who Norman Lamont was. He was a Conservative Chancellor in the early 1990s. I was his speechwriter for a period when I worked in the Treasury. So here you see the textbook, and we did the textbook in the 1990s. Here you see the deficit in blue and GDP growth in red over the recession of the early 1990s. And you can see what happened. We let the deficit spike, and if you see that's the cyclically adjusted deficit. The actual deficit is much higher than that, up to about 8 or 9% of GDP at this rate. And the Norman and Ken Clark said very explicitly, we will cut the deficit. We will put in place a credible medium for a fiscal consolidation plan. We will put up taxes, we'll put up GDP. But it won't happen until we've got a sustained recovery. And you can see, we did get a sustained recovery. And the result, of course, was, incidentally, we grew out of recession. We started cutting the deficit came down because of both growth and credible fiscal consolidation, because we got the sequencing right. It's not rocket science. A conservative government can do it. A conservative government did it before. It's such a shame that the current one didn't learn the lessons of the past. So, directly addressing Steve's point, he threw out statistics about how great things were going. I think this of course, is the chart which answers the basic question, has austerity failed? If you think we've had austerity, and I agree with certainly some of what Andrew said about the sequencing and timing of precisely what's happened, there's a lot to that. I won't go into the details now because of time. But this simply shows the results in terms of GDP. So the black line is the UK GDP relative to the start of point of recession. And so you can see we did have a very sharp fall in the first 12 months. GDP fell quite a lot, although not as much as it did in 1920-24 and about as much as it did in 1930-34. These are previous recessions. But what's happened is we've had a recovery that has been far, far weaker than any of the recoveries of the past. The recovery after the Thatcher recession, the recovery after the Lawson recession, which I just mentioned, the recovery after the two recessions of the interwar period, and the second period. In all of those, after the initial shock, we saw a decent and eventually sustained recovery. We may now be getting to that, but that black line between 18 months and 60 months, the period of stagnation, that is what austerity economics, if that's what we had, and I recognize the other side has slightly different views on whether we've had it or not. But what we've had is delivered that, and there is no way that that can be considered anything other than a failure. And similarly, what's it delivered in terms of deficit coverage? Well, the green line is what we've had and what's planned. The original line, or the white line, is what the plan was. So as you can see, the deficit is basically sort of flatlining at the moment. It will begin to fall again, according to the responsibility, in a year or two. And that's primarily as a result of, as the recovery gets growing, it becomes easier to manage both a bit of fiscal consolidation at the same time as reasonable growth. We will eventually get back on track. But we have had a considerable amount of unnecessary pain in the intervening period. I do want to say again that this is not, I do think we shouldn't overdo things. We are not Spain, thank God, or Greece, or Latvia, or Ireland. We have not had the same amount of, because we're not in the Eurozone, because we have had our own currency, we have not been obliged by the markets to impose the same amount of unnecessary fiscal consolidation that those countries have. We have had it easy. We've also been saved by the fact that our labour market, as a consequence of the reforms of the 80s and 90s and 2000s, is considerably more flexible than it once was. And those are good things, despite some of the problems associated. So we in some respects, we can count ourselves lucky. But on the very basic level was the front loading of fiscal consolidation, which was implemented in 2010, was that either necessary or successful? The answer is fairly clear as that. There was an alternative. It's the macro 101 alternative, I think we started was to allow the deficit to remain high, if but only if the output gap remains high, to boost spending on capital investment, not cut it, to boost spending on house building, to implement labour market programs, and we're quite good at labour market programs in this country. We know they work. We had a program called the Future Jobs Fund, which worked very well, actually, until it was cancelled by the incoming government. And then to set out a plan for credible medium-term fiscal consolidation, because I think all of us agree that over the medium term it is necessary to get the public capital accounts. All this is pretty standard stuff. It's textbook stuff. It's sort of what we did in the 90s. We could have done it again. We chose not to. As a consequence, the good deal of unnecessary damage we could have done. Thank you.
And to conclude the case for opposition, we have Professor Kevin Dowd, Professor of Finance and Economics at Dowd.
Thank you, Robbie. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to say first off, the discussion we've had reminds me of an old joke that went around when President Obama was first in office. Basically, it was along the lines that his economics team would have spent $1 trillion before they worked out where the washrooms were in the White House. And I think that sort of says a lot, really. I'd also like to thank Robbie for the clever seating disposition we have, where he's put the right-wing economists on the left, the left-wing economists on the right. Anyway, my theme is that austerity hasn't failed. And the reason it hasn't failed is because it hasn't been tried. And so basically I would see this motion as an exercise in, to be frank, Keynesian propaganda. If you want to fix a debate, frame the question. It's all about framing. We all do it. So we have here austerity on the one hand versus growth on the other. Austerity is bad, growth is good. No one really wants austerity. So we then have a recession, and there's lots of talk about cuts and hardship. So the recession must be due to austerity, and therefore austerity was to fail. And I would say this is basically nonsense. And the reality, I think, is that most talk about austerity having failed is, in practical terms, an excuse for more stimulus for Keynesians who are in denial about the real questions that we face. So I would say that we need to consider the evidence, and we need to be clear about our terms. So what do we mean by austerity? Well, austerity is simply the opposite policy of stimulus. Now consider the evidence. The ratio of government debt to GDP has increased by about 16% since 2008. Official UK debt has increased by well over 100% since 2008 and is now about 80% of GDP or 135% or whatever, depends how you measure it. But whatever estimates you accept, a massive increase in debt over a few years is hardly austerity. Even the coalition government, since it came to power, has seen official debt increase by 56%. Okay, you might say, well, the deficit's gone down, but so what? The point is, there's a massive accumulation of debt. More importantly, the official figures ignore a vast amount of unofficial debt, your PFI, unfunded pensions and all that stuff. Commitments entered into, but not provided for and shoved off the balance sheet. So the true level of debt is very much higher. Official bank rate is 0.5%, the lowest ever. It's been at that level since March 2009. This is well below the rate of inflation, implying very strongly negative real interest rates. Of course, this is very much a stimulus policy, because whether it works or not is another matter. As for the monetary aggregates, M0 has grown by about 260% since before the Lehman crash. The central bank has massively expanded its balance sheet, and now has a balance sheet much like that of any other highly leveraged hedge fund. M1 has grown by 8%, M2 by 18%, and the real economy has shrunk. Now admittedly M4 has been flat since then, but one can hardly deny that the central bank have done their best to boost it. In fact, the flatness of M4 is basically due to deleveraging. So in sum, recent argument government policies are not austerity at all, they're stimulus. I think as Steve said, if that's not stimulus, you tell me what is, or profligacy, tell me what is. Now I can see that diehard Keynesians could argue that these stimulus policies have failed because there hasn't been enough stimulus. Please take that view by all means, although I don't share it. But in that case, you would have to support our side of the debate. Now there's a good analogy here, which students occasionally appreciate. One wakes up in the morning with a headache. That's recession, and it's a bad thing. However, one has imbibed a little bit too much the night before. So this is recession, which is bad. So the imbibing the night before felt good at the time, but doesn't feel good now. So what do you do? The Keynesian says the headache's unbearable, I need another drink. Never mind that it didn't work last night. I certainly need another dose of stimulus now. And so the Keynesian keeps repeating the same old mistake, whereas the Austrian student learns his lesson. And so the Austrian economist says the best thing to do is to tough it out and try not to do it again. Now the issue therefore is not what do I need to do to feel better immediately. The issue is what should I do? You have to frame the question right. So the Austrian economist says the cause of the recession is the boom that precedes it. Whereas the Keynesian says we just need another fix. In other words, in any case, in the long term we're all dead. So instead of seeing austerity as some optional pain that we can choose to avoid, we should see it as necessary medicine. It might not be pleasant, but it's good for us. We need to get the excess out of the system. The evidence also indicates that austerity works. It worked in 1976, when the excesses of the hard-left Labour-led governments of 74 to 76 eventually led to the infamous IMF bailout. The economy then recovered strongly when the IMF imposed austerity policies began to work. Then, even more than now, there were howls from the left about the evils of austerity, yet austerity was exactly the medicine we needed. Let me give you a memorable quote here. At the Labour Party conference in 1976, the Prime Minister, Jim Callaghan, made an astonishing admission. He said, we used to think that you could spend your way out of recession and increase unemployment by boosting government spending. I tell you, in all candour, that option no longer exists. And insofar as it ever did exist, it only worked by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy, followed by a higher level of unemployment. Now, these words are among the most important in the history of modern British politics. Here you had a left-wing Prime Minister admitting that too much state spending was dangerous, whilst being heckled by a rabble of bearded trots from his own party. It turned out that Callaghan was right, the economy turned around. We also see this in other countries. For example, we see that the pigs are mired in recession, whereas the bells, Bulgaria and the Baltics, are recovering. The key factors here are that the former are overwhelmed with debt and high government spending, and the latter are not. I would go further and argue that austerity is not just good for us, but essential. The government already consumes more than half our national product, and there simply isn't the scope to grow the government further without making the tax burden even more crippling than it already is. More pressing still is the burden of government debt. Is this, rather than the absence of demand, that is now holding the economy back? Now, if I had time, I would talk about the myriad ways in which the government regulates, stifles the private sector through mindless regulation, the problems created by policy uncertainty and all that sort of stuff. But just take that as read. Now, I mentioned earlier that the true debt burden is much greater than official statistics suggest. Reliable estimates suggest that it is many times greater, perhaps an order of magnitude greater. I've seen credible estimates of up to 1,000% of GDP. In effect, government debt is already so massive that it cannot be repaid, so default is inevitable. So we're literally hurtling towards the edge of the cliff. The difference between the two sides here is that we are saying maybe this isn't such a good idea, whereas proponents of more stimulus are suggesting that we're not rushing forward to the cliff fast enough. And I think Steve mentioned earlier Larry Koplikov, perhaps the leading expert in the United States. He's on record as saying that because the US has the same problem, the debt level there is $211 trillion. And that's a figure so big, it has 12 zeros, you can easily lose sight of it. It's real money. It boils down to a debt per family of close to $1 million. It's not repayable. And Koplikov basically says the United States is bust but doesn't know it, and he imagines scenarios in which Americans would flee the United States to escape the crippling debt levels that they would be saddled with. So to pull all this together, I would suggest that you need to see this motion in the context of a broader Keynesian propaganda war, in which the Keynesians are arguing for more of the very medicine that's already threatening to destroy us. The evidence shows that the policies pursued have been very stimulative. Growth in government spending, huge debt, negative real interest rates, massive growth in the size of the balance sheet of the central bank. So you can only consider supporting the motion if you can somehow manage to misconstrue, I would suggest, with all respect to the opposing side, this policy mix as the opposite of what it really is. Now, I would suggest too that we must also oppose this motion even if we're an ultra-Keynesian who doesn't believe that we've had enough stimulus. While I've got a little bit of time, I'd like to just make some other comments here about austerity in general. First off, although I'm supporting austerity, I'm not advocating a council of despair, even though it might look like it. I think, first off, that there are ways of doing austerity and ways of not doing it. Ireland is an example of a totally botched austerity programme, which was criminal. The Irish government was bullied into an overnight bailout, which bankrupted the country overnight. It was illegal under Irish law. The government was so panicked that it didn't feel it could call a cabinet meeting to discuss it. It was never put to a proper vote of Parliament. It was rejected by the people, and there's been no accountability there. Ireland should be policy. Now, the other thing I would say here is that what are the positive things we can do? Well, number one, we can fix the banking system. A lot of the problem, as several speakers have mentioned, is that we have socialised risks, privatised profits. This is a poisonous cocktail which both the left and the right have rightly complained about. Although I must say, I think that the left lost much of their right to complain about it when they failed to support a private member's bill that would have put this right. And it's the only policymaker I've ever seen in this country that got to the root of the issue, and that's Steve Baker's private member's bill on fixing the banking system, which not a single Labour MP supported. Anyway, finally I'll just end by saying, I could go on and on, I'm running out of time. Last but not least, to all you students, please do throw out those Canadian textbooks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Now, before we move on to the vote, I just want you all to join me and thank our panel of 6 speakers today. We've all done a phenomenal job in what has been a very, very enlightening and insightful debate. Okay, so now to what we've been waiting for. Will, we're going to vote proposition, we're going to count proposition numbers. Rohan, can you count opposition numbers? You raise your hand in favour of whichever side of the motion, and Akansha, can you do abstentions, please? So, if you are in favour of the motion, this House believes austerity economics has failed, please raise your hand. Approximately fine. If you do not believe austerity is failed, please raise your hand. Same goes. Please do not raise your hand. There are two behind there as well. I think we can use the game to share.
People do positively abstain in the House of Commons.
House, if you like. We should. Well, quickly do that. It's too close for comfort. I don't trust your counting. Okay, proposition, one more time. Very quickly so we can check. Okay, and opposition. One more time, please. There are how many behind that? Two by the stairs as well. So on both occasions, abstentions, anyone? I vote for it. Okay, so from 2 rounds of voting, it's been very, very close. So it's a credit to all of our debaters today. But it appears that this House does believe austerity economics has failed. So congratulations to proposition and my condolences to opposition.